Coming up, Howard Beck joins the show to discuss all things Brooklyn Nets basketball from a perspective on GM Sean Marks and whether or not he is the right man to be at the helm for this pseudo rebuild. If Cam Johnson has a price tag that could get too high for the Nets this offseason, what can be done about the Ben Simmons situation? And will this team go after a big star via trade as the draft approaches next month? We dive into all of these topics and more coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast and your New Jersey Devils on the Devils Puck Luck podcast. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We're free on all those great platforms, and with no time to spare and no need to want to do it, we dive right in on the conversation with Howard. All right, as promised, when you are on the Locked On Podcast Network, you get access to people from around the sports world, around the NBA, that allow us to get a little bit more insight and expertise around the Brooklyn Nets and where they could be headed. We're very excited and happy to welcome in Howard Beck. You know him formerly from Sports Illustrated, Bleacher Report, and the New York Times, now a current contributor for GQ Sports, as well as, quite frankly, Howard, a frequent flyer on the Locked On Podcast Network. How are you? Thank you for making some time.
Doing well, Adam. Thanks for having me. I've got a lot of points racked up on my frequent flyer Locked On card. I can't wait to cash it in for prizes and a year's supply of Rice-A-Roni.
David Locke will hook you up with any number of our sponsors across the network. There will be a supply package put in the mail to you immediately.
I look forward to that.
But as we, of course, have the NBA playoffs unfolding, the Brooklyn Nets, sadly, were a part of it, very briefly, getting swept by the Philadelphia 76ers. So our attention goes to, what is this team in the post-superstar era? And the first question we really had was, in this offseason, a team that still has financial restrictions, even after shedding Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving via trades, are they a team that you see as viable to go out and make a big move this offseason and try to keep themselves as a at least mid-level contender for the playoffs?
Yeah, listen, they definitely have a couple of different routes they could go here, Adam. And that said, I have them like, I've not gotten that deep into like considering all of the offseason agendas of all the teams. But off the top of my head, I think the Nets are actually the most fascinating team this offseason because they're already good, solid, right? Like they've got this really interesting array of players and a lot of high quality players. And I assume they're going to keep Cam Johnson a restricted free agent. They'll do what they have to, whether it's preemptively signing him or matching whatever any other team does, which they'll have the right to do. But it's a lot of talent, but not the kind of high level talent that's going to get you deep in the playoffs. And it's a lot of redundant talent because a lot of 3-and-D wings, right? So to me, when you combine the surplus of 3-and-D wings, the surplus of just quality mid-tier players, right? Second-tier players, and all those draft picks, mostly the ones they got from Phoenix, but some also what they have from Philly, you have the recipe for a blockbuster. You are well situated as any team in the NBA to acquire the next disgruntled superstar. And in this league, that's the beauty of the NBA. There's always a discontented superstar somewhere. Somebody's going to ask out, or some team is going to go sour on their max player. And you never know who that's going to be. We know who some of the names that have been kicked around this cycle are. All speculative at this point. We can get into that along the way here. But if somebody says it's time to go, the Nets are as well positioned as any team to make that deal, because what you need is a surplus of picks and especially an array of mid-level contracts, right? 8, 10, 12, 15 million, not necessarily max deals, but a combination that you can put together that's manageable for the team that you're trading with. So yes, that's start there. Then consider Sean Marks' history as Nets GM. He comes into just a desolate rebuilding situation with no picks available to him. He's in much better shape this time, obviously. No picks, no real talent, not a lot to work with. But he built methodically until it was time to not build methodically anymore and then go all in. And he's ahead of the game in this rebuild. And he's got, a recent extension. So he's got the latitude to play this any number of ways. If the opportunity is there to make the big splash immediately, if a star is available, he can do it right now. If that star is not available, or if that star is traded elsewhere because that team decides they like somebody else's trade package better, fine. Sean Marks can take what's here, make some more minor adjustments, get a couple of reinforcements, and they'll have a perfectly good middle of the pack, I think, playoff team next season.
I want to touch on you because you mentioned Cam Johnson, that impending contract. But how do you think did Mikal Bridges' performance after the trade from Phoenix and what he did down the stretch, and even against Philadelphia, albeit a sweep, I think he obviously proved I can be a top flight player on the playoff stage in NBA basketball. Does that change how Sean Marks approaches this offseason? They knew his value, but seeing it in front of you with your own eyes say maybe we should be more willing to go down that big trade road?
It's an interesting question. I think of it a couple different ways. In some ways, maybe it complicates matters because now you're wondering like, whoa, hold on. I didn't realize he had this gear, right?
Right.
So now you're thinking, well, do we already have our number one? I think no. I think he's still like he's your 1A or he's your 2, right? So you still need, I'm not saying these guys specifically, but you need a Kevin Durant or a LeBron James, a Joel Embiid. You need that true North Star. And I think that Mikal Bridges will be a phenomenal wingman, in both figuratively and literally. So I think he showed a lot. And I think when you have that much more confidence that the star you're trying to get can look at what Mikal Bridges has done and say, wow, I want to play with that guy. And they probably thought that anyway. Everybody loves Mikal Bridges. They loved him in Phoenix also. But any superstar, when considering a move, wants to know the team they're going to has at minimum, a really great supporting cast that will allow them to play at a high level and win at a high level immediately. But 2, if at all possible, a second star to play off of for the nights that you're not feeling it, or to take some of the pressure off you, or to keep the defense honest. So what Bridges did, I don't want to overplay the complicated things. It's a good complication, obviously.
Yeah.
It has absolutely enhanced the Nets' sales pitch to any star they're trying to recruit. And when I say that, obviously it's not through cap space, but nobody gets anybody through cap room anymore anyway. It's trades. And guys can't always dictate where they're going to go. But if they are surveying the landscape as the next guy forces his trade and giving his team the list of places that I'd prefer to go, it's reasonable to think the Nets are high on that list, partially because of location and market, and partially because, guys will want to play with a guy like Mikal Bridges as their co-star, and this array of whoever else is remaining as the supporting cast once you've made the trade.
How much then do you think, because we always talk about this when it comes to coming out of the Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving era, okay, you mentioned Sean Marks and what he accomplished building up to a point where now you can go pursue the superstars. It doesn't go the way you intended it to, and you end up ultimately having to acquiesce to a trade request and frankly move off of Kyrie Irving because it seemed like you had been fed up with him as an organization to whatever extent. Does that impact the way other players perceive an organization? Because we've talked about that perception of, would players want to come here? Would superstars look at this as being a potential difficulty to play underneath GM Sean Marks with owner Joe Tsai? Or is it all relative to what that player thinks and who they have on there? I like Mikal Bridges. I like Cam Johnson. I want to go play with them. The team, the location may be relative, even though including the aspects you mentioned, like still being an offshoot of a major market in New York.
You've got to be a pretty messed up organization for players to want to steer clear of you. No, I mean that seriously, right? Like, there's a number of different versions of this that we could cite, but the general default, and when you talk to agents and GMs will tell you this too, people on both sides of that equation, ultimately a guy is going to go where he can get the money, hopefully as many years as possible, the role he wants, his teammates will matter, his coach will matter. I think it's very low on the list for most players and their agents how they feel about the front office and ownership. I'm not saying it's irrelevant. It does matter. It does matter. And I do think there are organizations over the years, and I don't want to, start, firing strays here. But there are plenty of organizations we could all cite that over the years were ones that guys might have looked at a little askew and said, I'm not sure I entrust my career to that franchise. They've been dysfunctional. They have not developed guys well, or they've had stars and failed to support them, failed to surround them with the right talent. But the general outline of Nets dysfunction, let's examine that for a second here, is they signed Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. They acquired James Harden, and then one by one, each of those guys asked out. So in the general outline of that, the basic narrative looks pretty damning, right? But James Harden, the first to asked out in large part. If we're doing the pie chart, it's a very, very big part of the pie chart because of Kyrie Irving and his frustration with Kyrie Irving. Yeah. Kyrie Irving asked out because of Kyrie Irving. And because he wasn't going to get the contract he wanted. It wasn't even about, like, Kyrie Irving left and then started firing shots saying, oh, the organization's so messed up, everybody knows it, blah, 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 blah. Well, you left because you wanted a contract they wouldn't give you, and they didn't want to give you the contract because of how unreliable you had been. So he's not a reliable witness on this subject. And then, of course, Kevin Durant wanted out because once Kyrie was gone, like, what am I doing here if it's just me? I could make a case why Kevin Durant should have wanted to stay and give them time to kind of rebuild around him, whatever. But hey, I don't begrudge him. He came here with Kyrie Irving and he wants to leave when Kyrie leaves. I kind of predicted as much in a story that I got a lot of grief for from some part of Nets fandom back in like November, December, when I wrote they needed to blow it up preemptively. Anyway, that's neither here nor there.
Well, I will say, because no. And by the way, you just encapsulated what it is to have covered this team and to discuss these topics, because every avenue you go down, there's 2 or 3 more offshoots of it and things that happened and how you try to evaluate it. I remember back at the start of the season when Doug Norrie and I discussed, what do we think the Nets should do? I said the same thing I said, I think that they should blow it up, because if the goal is a championship, this version of the team's not going to do it. Yeah. Now, I immediately got swept right back up into it all when they're going on big winning streaks, and you go, or maybe they can get there. So
yeah, and trust me, the people who did not like my preemptive blow it up now piece at the end of November or whatever it was were hitting me hard during that streak of however 18 out of 20 or whatever it was. But, I think I was vindicated in the end. Unfortunately, I didn't, I'm not taking any joy in that. It's unfortunate. And I've said many times, like, I cannot recall in my 26 years of covering the NBA, another franchise that willingly, granted with a gun to its head, but willingly blew up a plausible contender at midseason. Sometimes you tear it down in the offseason after a failure or whatever, but to actually be, and I didn't think they were going to win it all. And I never believed in them, which is why I said preemptively blow it up. But they had the outline of a contender. They had the record and the performance, and it looked like they would at least have a shot. And so anyway, I don't think that their reputation overall has suffered that much. I do think there are probably some players around the league and some agents who might go, we can't dismiss all of that. Yeah, sure, all roads lead back to Kyrie on this, but how well did they handle this? How well did Sean Marks and Joe Tsai handle this? And I think those are legitimate questions to ask. But again, I still think in the end, it comes back to, look, they finished the season pretty strong. They've got good players, high character guys. People love Jacques Vaughn, and Sean Marks, for whatever else he has, whatever his missteps have been, and there certainly have been some, he has proven already once that he can build a contender from virtually nothing. And then, and again, in this case, he's got that much more to work with. So I think even though he could, under some circumstances, logically take the fall for how far this has come undone, he's also probably the best suited to rebuild from the stage they're at now, because he's already shown once before that he could do it. And again, with even fewer tools in the box.
Right back to the excellent conversation with Howard Beck after we let you know that for a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. And it's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure that every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage on eBay Motors. Don't put it into My Garage, and look for the green check to know that the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game. And you know that that's going to be the case when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Motors. Fit only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. And now, back to the conversation. Yeah, it's the irony of he's the guy that built it up and also was there when it fell apart, but might be the best suited to build it back up again, right?
Sure.
And it's rare when it comes to a GM. The other factor then here is because there's going to be some new CBA elements that are getting introduced by the NBA that is going to make it a little more restrictive. A lot of the moves that the Nets made over the last few seasons, they wouldn't have been able to achieve underneath the new CBA coming in 23-24. But when you look at the trajectory of this team then going forward, the biggest hurdle or the biggest question mark now is Ben Simmons. How or what would you do if you were in Sean Mark's shoes when it comes to Ben Simmons? He has no value right now. The money is absolutely astronomical relative to the production or lack thereof around his availability. Is there any solution to the Ben Simmons situation beyond saying, I hope he gets healthy, I hope he plays, and then you reassess what his value is to your team versus to another?
A few different schools of thought on the Ben Simmons thing. One is the bleakness that you laid out at the start of that question, which is, I mean, he's being paid like a top 10 player, and he's been playing like a bottom 10 player. Like he is that contract is, I think, the single biggest albatross in the league right now, and there's no reason to believe at present that Ben Simmons is going to reclaim the level of play that made him an all-NBA player in Philadelphia. It could happen. It certainly could happen. But there are obviously an array of concerns there, mentally, physically, emotionally, all of it. Like, he's gone through a lot. He has been open about things that he's gone through. And it's just hard to tell now. Is this a physical thing? Is this a confidence thing? There are people around the NBA who question whether he really loves the game or whether he's just there because he's good at it. And he's not the only one. You know, Pat Beverly just went, on record recently as saying like 50% of players in the NBA don't love the game. And people around the NBA don't necessarily disagree with that. Like there's a range. So does Ben Simmons love basketball enough? Does he love being great enough? Is he going to work to get back to it? And can he physically? I don't know the answer to those questions. But as long as we have those questions, everybody else in the league does too. And it's going to make them very, very hesitant. So he's actually that his contract, if you were trying to trade Ben Simmons, you're probably having to attach stuff to him, right? He is not bringing you back. Once upon a time, it was like, oh, should the Sixers, when they seemed like they were hitting a ceiling with him and Embiid, it was, should they swap Ben Simmons for Dame Lillard? Should they swap Ben Simmons for Bradley Beal? This is a few years ago. You're like, forget Beal for a minute, because that's a really tough one. Even Dame at this stage, who's just come off one of his best statistical seasons, the Blazers, if Dame asked out tomorrow, the Blazers aren't just taking Ben Simmons in a straight up swap, as you might have been able to argue once upon a time. It's going to be, no. You have to attach stuff to Ben Simmons, and then you have to send other stuff to equate to Dame Lillard separately. Ben Simmons is a net negative. He's a negative asset. That said, I've talked to a couple people over the last few days, just kind of trying to get more info on, what are the Nets doing early in these early stages of the offseason. As I understand it, they have already been making calls to gauge his value. So now I don't think that should be considered like breaking news by any stretch. Of course they're doing that. All teams are doing their due diligence all the time. And considering that Ben Simmons' contract is as difficult as it is for them to have on the books, considering they do have luxury tax concerns, considering they are trying to now rebuild around the Mikhail Bridges, Cam Johnson, Nick Claxton core, it makes absolute sense that you would just see whether it's possible to offload Ben Simmons without too much pain, meaning without having to attach too many things. I don't know what they'd have to attach. Some people suggested to me you'd have to attach a boatload of stuff for another team to take him, which brings us back to the more likely scenario, which is you do everything possible to build him back up. You support him in every way possible, and you hope for the best. And you hope that Ben Simmons can get back to an all-star or all-NBA level, or at least a level where he's a net positive again, either for you or to enhance his trade value.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so interesting to see if he's healthy and he starts this season and he looks like any version of the previous Ben Simmons we've seen play, are the Nets inclined to try to keep or be ready to move on from him as quickly as possible to avoid another pitfall? Because it does feel like it's only a matter of when the next thing happens with him from an injury standpoint at a minimum before you wait for that other shoe to fall. So that then, knowing that there's $40 million tied up in him next season, and this team now has the draft coming up, I'm not concerned about specific prospects when it comes into the draft. But on yesterday's episode, we discussed what Sean Marks had done over the last several years when it came to the draft. Facilitated moves to get D'Angelo Russell, converted a multiple first-round picks that ultimately became, in jettisoning Thaddeus Young years ago, Karis LeVert. And that went into the package that converted into, ultimately, James Harden coming in, right? So he's shown the ability and willingness to kind of wheel and deal when it comes to the draft. Do you see a world where, is it more likely to you that Sean Marks is trying to take a Dorian Finney-Smith, who it was reported could have been worth 2 first-round picks at the deadline, a Royce O'Neal, veteran player, maybe worth a first-round pick? We don't know where Cam Thomas's value currently stands in the organization or in the NBA. But do you think it's more likely that Sean Marks goes in saying, I want to do as much as possible to restructure this roster around that new core, as opposed to maybe standing pat and just saying, this is a 2 to 3 year process. I can't try to leapfrog, maybe in the way we did when the opportunity came up to get a Kyrie Irving, to get a Kevin Durant?
It's hard to say because a lot of the NBA is just opportunism, right? The Rockets back, 10 years ago were just biding their time, a little more than 10 years ago, 11 years ago, 12 years ago. They're biding their time. Daryl Morey is just swapping out pieces constantly, right? Trying to find high value guys, and then eventually, the Thunder have luxury tax concerns and want to trade James Harden. And the Rockets were in a great position to make the deal that the Thunder wanted at that time. It's opportunism, right? The Timberwolves didn't know they could get Rudy Gobert until they did. Hasn't worked out that well so far, but whatever. The Cavaliers for Donovan Mitchell. All of these, right? So because I don't think we can know here in early May before, we're still a week out from the lottery, a little less than a week out from the lottery. We don't know where everybody's draft position is going to be, or what teams are going to do once the draft positions fall into place, or what they'll actually do when the draft happens in June. So it's hard to know what the opportunities for the Nets will be. So I would expect, both things are possible, right? You use the picks because those are cheaper players, and now maybe you feel freer to offload some of your higher priced veterans while you're trying to duck the tax. And it's always nice to have guys on cheaper, controllable contracts. Also, by the way, the Nets have a good, under Sean Marks, have a pretty good track record of finding value later in the first round, whether it's, LeVert, Jared Allen, Claxton, whatever. They've done a really great job historically. So I think there's a confidence there too, that we'll get somebody of value or 2 guys of value in the early 20s there. But if someone comes calling, or if that next star that we're talking about opts to make their trade demand, those picks, as with everything else they've got, could easily be on the move.
Before we let you go on what'll just, I think, be, for me anyway, what feels like the short-term most likely outcome for the Brooklyn Nets and what that means for them, we mentioned there at the top Cam Johnson and that impending contract. They have Joe Harris. There's $20 million there. They can try to shift or dump it. The money, in spite of not having 2 superstars on the roster, is still a little wonky for this organization. Is there a threshold for you where the Brooklyn Nets wouldn't match an offer that gets made for Cam Johnson? We're talking about 20-ish kind of million. I think you have to dream on him taking another little step forward here. Not the same maybe size that Mikhail Bridges did, but you do need to see more growth from a 27-year-old player. At what point do you look at $25 million a year and go, well, now we're kind of doing it to ourselves again, as we have in the past?
Yeah. I mean, there's always that danger But look, I don't know who's repping Cam Johnson, but if I'm repping Cam Johnson, I'm feeling so great walking into this negotiation because you traded Kevin freaking Durant for a package that included my client, and my client's a restricted free agent. I don't know what he'll get if you just let him walk out there and see, like, and I always think that's a bad idea anyway. Don't let your restricted free agent go. Don't do the go set the market for yourself. Like that's a recipe for just bad vibes, right? Be aggressive, show the guy how much you want him, make a really great offer, even if you're quote unquote overpaying a little bit. And they'll probably overpay, but Cam Johnson's still young enough to keep improving. And he's a phenomenal player already. You want to have him there, and you did trade Kevin Durant to get him as well as Mikhail Bridges and the rest of it. So if I'm his agent, like I say, like I'm walking in thinking like, hey man, give me the sun and the moon and the stars, because if my guy walks, if you lose him, you're going to look really bad. You know, this is an asset you have to protect, and I'm sure they will.
And while being the best friend and one half of the twin duo with Mikhail Bridges doesn't hurt his opportunities.
And their
either.
dogs are friends, according to the story that Tanya Ganguly, my friend for the New York Times, did a while back. Like, you can't break up those guys. You can't break up their dogs. You're all in on this thing at this point.
There is a chance they trade the dogs and the players. We never know for sure. The NBA is a fickle matter. So let's then assume, because I agree with you that you should match with Cam Johnson. I think that this is, while fans have to recalibrate their expectations, this is an exciting new era for the Brooklyn Nets. If we assume it is Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, Nicholas Claxton at the core of this team going forward, and adding in at least one drafted player this season and maybe some minor adjustments to the roster, what is this team over the next couple of seasons while they wait for the Rockets to get through the picks that they sent to them and get into the spot where they actually control their own draft capital?
Well, and you make a really important point there that I had failed to bring up yet, Adam, which is that, they obviously have all the incentive in the world to be good. Now, they weren't going to tank anyway because the trades they made brought them back good players. They were definitely going to be good. But just being good enough sometimes makes you, put you in a position to fall into the play-in, and then you could be out, and then now you're a lottery team and your lottery picks are not yours. So, like, they have all the incentive in the world to want to win and accelerate this. So I tend to think they're not going to slow play this. One interesting name to keep an eye on, it's been suggested to me, and they can't get him outright because of obviously they don't have the cap room. But if Fred VanVleet leaves Toronto, and I think the Nets do have a need there. I'm not sure their confidence level in Spencer Dinwiddie. Look, they let him walk once before. He's eligible for an extension. They didn't want to pay him once before. That's why he left. He had some really high moments and a couple of shaky moments in his return. And so I don't know what the formula there is. I don't know where Fred VanVleet ends up this summer, or if he stays, he may stay in Toronto. But if the Raptors are looking to make moves and to shake up this core, which it seems like they're feeling like things are a little stale, Fred VanVleet, high character guy, and great, he's a really good two-way player. At his best, he is a very good three-point shooter. High character guy. I mean, just great overall dude. If you're just building this roster of, like, forget superstars, you need one eventually, obviously, and they'll be looking for that too. But if you're talking about more mid-range moves that just kind of push the ball forward, and I do think they really need an upgrade at point guard now. VanVleet, it would have to be a sign and trade. And I don't know how that works. But like I say, it's been suggested to me that's one thing to potentially keep an eye on.
And it does seem to fit the mold of players that the Brooklyn Nets are moving forward with now. Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, and wanting to reset the fancy word NBA teams use when they're trying to figure things out, culture around the Brooklyn Nets. Obviously, going forward this offseason, there's going to be plenty of things to discuss with the Brooklyn Nets. As we mentioned, a contributor now with GQ Sports and a maven across the Locked On Podcast Network. Howard, we really do appreciate you taking the time, the insights around the Nets, and obviously we keep an eye on how it all unfolds. And be sure to check out Howard across the entire network, because, again, if you're interested in a deep analysis of teams and what they can accomplish in these playoffs, in these off seasons, the draft and beyond, Howard Beck is obviously someone with a level of understanding and expertise that we just appreciate having the time with.
Appreciate it, Adam. Thank you.
And there you have it, my friends. Howard Beck, obviously contributing member to GQ Sports, and you could see it, all the knowledge, all the information there, and really just a fun conversation that I think lets us know that, and we talked about this on the show. There's a lot still to come here for the Nets this offseason. There's a lot of positive elements they have that they can build off of, but it does come down to, what does Sean Marks do this offseason? Can he pull something off here when it comes to the draft? And that last little tidbit there, when we talk about a Fred VanVleet and then fitting into this roster, that might be one of those type of big moves that we wouldn't have necessarily have seen coming, that would change kind of how we look at this roster going forward, knowing what Fred VanVleet has accomplished in the NBA, knowing the fit that he falls into here. And that right there is why you love to listen to the Locked On Podcast Network and, frankly, to the Locked On Nets podcast. Excellent conversation there with Howard Beck, and really a lot of insights that I think remind us and the fan base that there are a lot of positives still around this organization. Sean Marks has to go out and execute this offseason in this draft, but there are paths forward where the Nets can remain competitive and maybe even elevate beyond what expectations are going into next season. That last little tidbit, by the way, is something that we will discuss further. Fred VanVleet, if you want to talk about big swings or surprising moves that Sean Marks could accomplish, if Toronto chooses to go in a new direction after firing Nick Nurse, we hear that there could be offers for Pascal Siakam getting floated out there. Fred VanVleet, we know there is a need at the point guard position. He is a traditional point guard, and it would start to create a little bit of a different dynamic there, allowing Spencer Dinwiddie to go back into his traditional role, coming off the bench, working the second unit, and just being a more viable and well-balanced roster. And you start to dream on what it could mean for a Mikhail Bridges, for a Cam Johnson, and everybody else. Now, let's not get over our skis about it. It is interesting to ponder on here as we move forward. In the meantime, friends, as you know, you get over to YouTube, you subscribe to the channel, you turn on the alerts, you get the podcast where you get those needs fulfilled. And as always, with no Doug Norrie, there is no quote short of saying that I miss my friend, and I can't wait until he's back so we can keep talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball. And there you have it. That is the value of being a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, getting to sit down and have a discussion with someone like Howard Beck, contributing member to GQ Sports, and obviously just an incredibly knowledgeable individual around the NBA. So we thank him again for his time, and it does remind us that we've discussed this all off season. We'll continue to discuss it. If Sean Marks is the man at the helm to execute this future, well, there are paths forward for him to have some big successes, including that little nugget on the back end there about Fred VanVleet. If Toronto chooses to go ahead in a different direction after letting go of Nick Nurse, a veteran player, a traditional point guard mold, Fred VanVleet would be a pretty impressive get for Sean Marks and would definitely change the way we look at what this starting unit could be, how it impacts the bench unit, and so much more. So dream a little dream on Freddie VanVleet if you can. And we'll, of course, be discussing that more as the offseason rolls along. Other big names that the Nets could take a look at. In the meantime, though, you get over to YouTube, you like, you subscribe, you go ahead and turn those alerts on so you know when all of our episodes are dropping. You get that podcast wherever you get those needs fulfilled. And until next time, as always, when there is no Doug Norrie, there is no quote short of saying, I miss my friend. And I can't wait till he's back so we can keep talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.